Have you ever heard the term defensive type injuries or defensive wounds?
Yes.
In your line of work, what does that mean?
They're wounds that characteristically are seen when a victim is attempting to either defend themselves actively or passively.
Did you make a determination based on your training and experience that these wounds here were most likely representative of a defensive type injury?
Yes, they could be consistent with defensive type wounds.
Publishing 202, we're now looking at his right forearm. Is there an injury noted here?
Yes.
Could you circle it?
There's a small incised wound here in the middle of the photograph.
Okay. Publishing 203, is this a more close-up view of that same injury?
Yes.
In your opinion, was this also consistent with a defensive wound?
It could be.
Turning to his left hand and forearm, did you also note injuries on his left hand and his left forearm?
Yes.
Okay. Publishing 199, could you show us where any injuries are depicted in that photograph?
There is an incised wound here on the dorsal aspect of the thumb.
Okay, is that dorsal mean top?
Yes.
Okay. And publishing 200. What did you note here?
And then again, there is an incised wound to the forearm.
Okay. Could you circle it for us?
Yes.
In your opinion, based on your training experience, did you also make a determination that these injuries to the left forearm and to the left hand are also consistent with defensive type wounds?
Yes, they could be.
Lastly, did you make a series of notations about a variety of other bruises or contusions or potentially even smaller lacerations throughout Mr. German's body?
Yes.
And publishing 188, do we see some of those in this photograph?
Yes.
And generally, where are these injuries?
So scattered predominantly across the forehead are some minor abrasions or, again, these scrape or scratch-like injuries.
If you could, just take your mouse and just show us what you're speaking about.
Etc.
Okay. When you've concluded your examination, did you reach a determination as to what the cause and manner of death was with respect to Jeffery German?
Yes.
And what was the cause of death?
Multiple sharp force injuries.
And what was the manner of death?
Homicide.
And in lay terms, what does homicide mean?
Homicide means death at the hands of another.
Thank you. I have no further questions for this case.
Yes, thank you. Doctor, how many stab wounds were on the body?
Sorry, I have to do some math in my head. I believe there are 6 stab wounds.
And how many slicing wounds, slashing wounds?
7 incised wounds.
Okay, so we have 6 and 7, 13.
Yes.
You had given testimony concerning what appeared to be a slashing wound to the front of the neck, correct?
Incised wound, yes.
And I'm referring specifically to State's Exhibit 189. I'm sorry. That would be the wound right here, correct?
Correct.
You would testify that that would have severed the carotid artery, correct?
It did sever the carotid artery, yes.
It did.
Yes.
And you would testify that that would be the primary source, the main source of blood to the brain.
Correct.
Safe to say that in so doing, having been severed, that would have admitted a substantial amount of blood.
It could have, yes.
Through your examination of the body, were you able to determine whether this wound had occurred in a standing position, a laying position?
No.
But assuming that it would have been a decisive wound or a primary cause of death wound, it would be safe to assume that Mr. German was standing. Fair to say?
I would not assume that, no.
No. So it's your testimony then that he could have basically received a fatal cut and gotten back up or been down. You're unaware as to the order. Fair to say?
Correct.
Of the 13 wounds suffered, would it be your characterization that this would be the most serious?
It is one of the more significant wounds, yes.
The other wound being to the left side of the body,
Yes.
near the heart,
Yes.
and that would have been the second most grievous, or the second most serious wound that Mr. German would have suffered, correct?
I would say that it is another significant wound, yes.
And is it also fair to say that given the location of the wound and the type of the wound, again, that would have emitted a great deal of blood?
Can you be more specific about where?
Would you expect that cut to bleed, that stab wound to bleed?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially. Would you expect it not to bleed?
There are certain circumstances, yes, where a lot of blood might not be produced.
And what would those circumstances be?
So bleeding could be externally or internally. So I guess you would have to delineate which one you're asking about.
You obviously performed the autopsy in this case. Did you see any signs of internal bleeding?
Yes,
And how significant was the internal bleeding?
there was a small amount of blood.
A small amount. So then it would be safe to assume that the bleeding was exterior. I mean, it would have left the body, correct?
It could have.
Okay. It would be, for a person to bleed a fair amount from this wound, would be consistent with the wound received. I mean, you have no reason to believe that it didn't bleed a fair amount.
Correct.
Same question concerning the wound to the neck. I mean, it's safe to assume that would have bled a lot because there were no signs of internal bleeding concerning that wound, correct?
There were signs of internal bleeding.
But a small amount versus a large amount.
At the time of the autopsy, correct.
Okay. So again, we'd have small internal bleeding, not major internal bleeding as to the two major wounds that occurred, correct?
At the time of the autopsy, yes.
Based upon your examination of the body, specifically the incised wounds, are you able to give an opinion as to the type of murder weapon or the weapon that caused these wounds?
No, other than sharp force injury, which would be due to a tool or implement with a sharp cutting edge, no.
Were any wounds particularly deep? What were the depth of them? And let's focus on the, outside of the defensive wounds, which obviously wouldn't give you an indication, but the two primary wounds.
The deepest wound, I believe, was measured at approximately 3 inches in depth.
3. And as far as the instrument, you can't give any opinion. Jagged edge, straight edge, anything of that nature.
Correct.
Safe to say that the instrument was not